I would like to invite Dr. David Rizik, and the Stent technologies are rapidly evolving, and I can't think of a better person than Dr. David Rizik, who is the Chief Scientific Officer and Director of Structural and Coronary Interventions at the Honor Health Heart Institute in Scottsdale, Arizona. David, take it away, please.
Thank you very much. It's a real honor to be here, and I'm very impressed with the meeting and the turnout and everything else, so congratulations to the organizers. This is really fantastic. I think there's reason to be optimistic about new technologies. The EVOLVE trial was discussed a few minutes ago, so I'm not going to really touch on synergy and sort of the metal stent technologies, but I'm going to use my 10 minutes to talk strictly about the bioabsorbable vascular scaffold, or BVS. Now, when you ask yourself what is the rationale for this, I think this slide really does demonstrate the rationale for developing a fully biodegradable device, a device that actually melts, that goes away within about a year. And this shows that even with best-in-class metal drug-eluting stents, modern generation metal stents, that there is about a 2% annual accrual of new events beyond 1 year, such that by 5 years, there's nearly a 20% recurrent event rate with best-in-class metal DES, and this makes the case. Here's a patient who had a drug-eluting stent placed 10 years ago, and you can see that was the stent, or the opening in the stent there, and the patient presented on aspirin antiplatelet monotherapy 10 years later, and out of nowhere thrombosed off the stent, and he ended up getting a PCI, as you can see. This is you have to put at least one BVS case in the talk, one moving image. So this is a patient who in the pivotal approval US trial had a high-grade lesion in the LAD, sort of a long lesion. It also demonstrates that the optimal methodology for imaging this is actually OCT. I think that's the best way to see it. And you can see, despite having metal-like scaffolding radial strength, the natural architecture of this somewhat tortuous vessel is maintained with BVS. It's not as hard to implant as some people make it to be. Now, about a year ago, we were sort of recovering from what was called the GHOST-EU trial. And in the GHOST-EU trial, this was a non-randomized observational series in which it was demonstrated that there was a 2.1% stent thrombosis rate at 6 months, and the authors of this paper said there was a 3.5% stent thrombosis rate at 1 year. Actually, this was an extrapolated value. This was an annualized value, not a measured value, but there was a 2.1% stent thrombosis rate at 6 months, with a few caveats. This was retrospective. There was no comparator arm in GHOST-EU. The site self-reported if there was an event or there was an event. Follow-up wasn't standardized. In terms of events, there was no independent adjudication body, no central angiographic core lab, no standardization in terms of how these stents were implanted, whether you use compliant balloons, not compliant balloons, et cetera. And I think it's very important to point out that in this study, less than 50% of the patients underwent a post-dilatation. Now, in my mind, whether you're putting a metal stent in or a new BVS stent, I think pre- and post-dil lesion preparation is paramount. That sort of like reminds me of, a college football game. There's several of us up here who are college football fans, and this reminds me of a college football game, this study, in which there is no referee, no rule book. We're not going to have a scoreboard either. Each team is going to keep their own score, decide what's a touchdown and not. There's going to be no timekeeper, and each player decides on his own whether or not he committed a penalty. I think we've demonstrated that GHOST-EU is a low level of evidence. Now, some higher levels of evidence going into the actual randomized trial. Let's look first at the ABSORB-2 trial. This was presented at TCT last year. Actually, it's interesting. This is a comparison of ABSORB versus Xience. Best-in-class metal DES. I think we'll all agree with that. Actually, the primary endpoint, there are two primary endpoints, co-primary endpoints. It's actually 3-year vasomotion and minimum luminal diameter at 3 years in response to nitrate and vasodilator exposure. But last year, at TCT, the one-year interim clinical data was demonstrated. And what was found is, whether you're talking about device or patient-oriented MACE events, there were actually no differences in MACE. Actually, if you look at BVS, fared very favorably compared to best-in-class metal DES. There were numerical differences in stent thrombosis, but certainly nothing that reached statistical significance. And at about 1 year, there was a 0.9% stent thrombosis rate in the absorbed group and none in the Xience group. Now, I like this trial. It's actually a prospectively randomized trial. It suffers only from being a single center experience. This is a one-to-one comparison between a durable polymer metal DES, a biodegradable polymer metal DES, and BVS, the fully dissolvable BVS device. Now, what I like about this study is that the authors of this study, though a single center experience, and there are some confounders in that, though a single center experience, they were meticulous. In fact, they were scrupulous about pre and post-DIL in this study. And you can see that in all three arms, whether metal stent or BVS, the stent thrombosis rates were 0 at the end of 9 months. I think this drives home the point that lesion preparation and patient selection is everything. And when you talk about lesion preparation and patient selection, certainly nobody does this better than the Japanese. This is a randomized trial called the Absorb Japan trial. It was a comparison of BVS and, again, Xience, best-in-class metal DES, and the primary endpoint being target lesion failure. Now, this is a very interesting study because in no other BVS study was there 100% pre-DIL, and look at the post-DIL, 82%. By comparison, in the pivotal approval trial in the US, the post-DILs was only about 50% in the BVS arm. So with meticulous attention to detail, scrupulous interventional technique, and the acute success and procedural duration is shown here, high procedural success. But look at the cost for doing such good pre-DIL and post-DIL. A delta of 5 minutes. It took only an additional 5 minutes. And there was very liberal use of imaging. Yet the BVS arm took only 5 more minutes to adequately image and prepare these vessels. What did we see? In this trial, there was no difference in target lesion failure. In fact, the rates of TLF between Xience and Absorb are nearly identical. No difference in the individual components of TLF, that is death, MI, and ischemic-driven TLR, but most especially this issue of stent thrombosis. At the end of 1 year, stent thrombosis between BVS and Xience is identical at just over 1%. I think this really does set the standard, and there's reason for optimism as we go forward with BVS. Now, I started to look at some good registry trials, not just randomized data, and this is the 4 cities registry. And what you see in this trial is that early on, before they were really paying attention to their implant technique, they had a good but not great experience in terms of event-free survival. But when they started doing better pre-dilatation, more liberal use of imaging, following the IFUs for implantation, and actually sizing up their balloon about a half a millimeter with an NC balloon after BVS implantation, look what happened over the course of their follow-up experience. There was an improvement, actually, in the event-free survival. Again, greater experience, more liberal use of imaging, improved outcomes. Here is the US pivotal approval trial, the Absorb 3 trial. I had the pleasure of being one of the PIs and one of the co-authors on this trial. It was published recently in the New England Journal of Medicine. And this, again, is a 2-to-1 comparison of BVS versus Xience, best-in-class metal DES. What was seen in this trial? First, you can see that target lesion failure, there were numerical differences, but not a statistical difference in terms of target lesion failure, and the individual components of TLF, death, MI, and ischemic-driven TLR. Using the SKY definition of a 10-fold increase in CKMB, using that threshold, there was no difference in periprocedural myocardial infarction between the 2 devices. Where there were somewhat significant numerical differences, but maybe not statistically significant differences, was indefinite and probable stent thrombosis at 1 year. The BVS arm had a stent thrombosis rate of about 1.5%, and the Xience arm was about half that at 0.74%. Now, a very interesting phenomenon was shown in this trial, and that is, while the eligibility criteria called for vessels to be 2.5 to 3.75 millimeters in diameter, 20% of the patients fell substantially below that. In fact, in those 20% of the patients who were less than 2.25 millimeters, the median diameter of the vessel was actually only about 2 millimeters. This is a thick-strutted stent, and I think putting any thick-strutted stent into a small vessel can explain these differences. And you can see most of the stent thrombosis was actually in these small vessels. And so we don't recommend that. Really, you have to maintain the threshold of about 2.5 millimeters or greater for implantation of this. Here's a sub-study that I PI'd. Of the Absorb 3 trial. This is the pharmacokinetic trial. You know, we understand the elution kinetics of Xience and everolimus off that stent. We wanted to make sure that there were no safety concerns in terms of everolimus eluting off of BVS. And what we found in this trial is that local coronary delivery of everolimus off the BVS device results in a very low systemic exposure, suggesting a low risk of toxicity. And we compared this to the Xience family of trials, and actually the PK profile of systemic everolimus exposure from BVS is identical to the Xience stent. So no safety concerns there. My concluding remarks are that, just to remind that in the pivotal approval US trial, there was no difference in TLF between BVS and best-in-class Xience. The individual components of TLF were not statistically different. There were no differences in stent thrombosis, though very clearly there are numeric differences, and I think this is due to the 20% use of this in small vessels. Some caveats: this study, Absorb 3, was underpowered for low-frequency events. I think we view these results in the context that Xience was the control stent, and it really is best-in-class metal DES in terms of safety and efficacy, so it was a very high bar, as has been suggested earlier in this session. I think it's also important to note that BVS is a first-generation device and was used for the first time by most of the US investigators for the first time. It's 154 microns. The next iteration of this device will be less than 100 microns. In addition, Boston Scientific has their FAST program, in which they're trying to fast-track a similar device that's going to be less than 100 microns. And I would leave you with the point that the most important criteria are your patient and lesion selection and adequate implant technique. This is a new device. There are idiosyncrasies to it, but I think with scrupulous attention to detail, we should be optimistic about the use of this device in the future. Thank you very much. Thank you, David.